Hello, everyone. This is Tom Fox back for another episode. I'm absolutely thrilled today to have Barbara Radnofsky and Ed Supkis to talk to us about their book, The Barber, the Astronaut, and the Golf Ball. So, guys, first of all, welcome and thank you so much for taking the time to visit with me today.
Thank you very much.
We're glad to be here.
Barbara, I know a little bit about your background, but our audience may not. Tell us about your professional background and what you're up to now.
I was a lawyer for many years and a mediator, and I taught mediation to young children. I also got involved in urban debate and promoting urban debate here in Houston, and decided to stop practicing law and get into writing more, and have written a couple of books and then collaborated with my husband on a documentary. And that has taken up a lot of our time, and we decided to write a book about what we learned about the space program and the people we love.
And Ed, could you tell us a little bit about your professional background and what you're up to today?
I was trained as a cardiovascular anesthesiologist, did that for a number of decades, and then I migrated into aviation medicine. So I'm a FAA medical examiner for the FAA.
You have picked, at least as a focal point, one of my favorite events, issues, topics, or moments from the trips to the moon, and that's the golf ball. And so I certainly understand, but why did you focus around the golf ball as the framework for broader or larger storytelling?
The focus was our barber, Carlos, unusual man who has a Navy history. And it was Carlos who led us to the golf ball and his relationship with Shepard, which everyone knew about if they were NASA Brats. And so it was Carlos, the barber, who got us involved.
I probably should have asked, how did you guys either split up the writing or collaborate together to come up with the book?
We started with a documentary, and it was there to show the provenance of the ball and the relationship between Carlos and Alan Shepard. And the documentary turned out to be wonderful. Unfortunately, it didn't have all the information that we learned from all the interviews. We did things in reverse. We did the documentary and then we did the book.
And we split up the work in this way. Ed did all the detail work, the research, the technical research to make sure that what we said was accurate. I'm the people person more, and I interviewed the subjects, including Charlie Duke, moonwalking astronaut, Carlos himself, and we learned a lot more about him. Alan Shepard's daughter, George Abbey, head of NASA, who was most cooperative because he was an old buddy of Carlos the barber and knew well of the relationship between Barber and the moonwalking first golfer on the moon, Alan Shepard. So we split it up that way. And then I got sick towards the end, and Ed had to step in, and he also finished the writing on the book.
So let's start with Carlos, as he's the fulcrum or focal point here. Tell us about Carlos Villagomez and just as a person.
Carlos grew up in the Bad Park, Houston, a big Hispanic family, went into the Navy because that's all he had. It was his only option, basically, at that time. And he progressed from there. He became an entrepreneur. He developed his barbershop in Webster, Texas, and beer garden that's world-renowned. And
he was a civil rights pioneer because he developed, after he got out of the Navy, he decided to become a barber thanks to the GI Bill. He saw much military action, much fighting in Indochina right after World War II, during the Korean crisis. And Carlos is the most unusual friend we have, and he's our oldest childhood friend from childhood. And we wanted to learn more about him and how he got the golf ball that was gifted to him by Alan Shepard. And that's why we did the documentary, and it didn't say enough. And so we felt we needed to fill in all of the other questions. Like when Carlos was volunteered by the Navy to submit to atomic bomb testing to see what would happen when a nuclear bomb was dropped on his boat.
Wow. And what was the result of that?
Carlos very calmly said, when we said, "Are you joking, Carlos?" He said, "No, I volunteered because that's what you do in the Navy when you're told to volunteer." I said, "What happened?" He said, "Oh, it was spectacular, spectacular." And he started describing the big plume of water. I said, "What happened to you?" He said, "The boat sank." And I said, "What happened to y'all, all of you?" He said, "Oh, they came and picked us up." That was Carlos's reaction.
And the only way we found out about it was we were interviewing Carlos, and he said, "I'm having some ringing in my ears." And we said, "What's all this ringing in your ears, Carlos?" And he said, "Oh, it was when I was in Indochina, the gunshots bouncing off the boat, that got my ears a little messed up. Then the nuclear explosion really messed me up."
Touche.
Yeah.
How long was Carlos a barber?
He did it immediately after. He still is a barber. He can't stand on his feet very well. He's in his late 80s. But he knew when he was either going to be a cobbler or a barber. When you come from the segregated wards of the Houston Ship Channel with 15 siblings, you have to pretty much make it on your own, and he did. But he did get money from the GI Bill, and we're talking about the early 50s.
Was he able to get technical training or trade school training for a barber to run a barber shop through his GI Bill benefits?
GI benefits paid for his tools, paid for some education, and got him started. It was the GI Bill. Same with, you'll find other characters in the book, including my dad, credit the GI Bill to how they got their education and how they made themselves in their careers. So yes, it was comprehensive for him.
I don't think many people remember what the GI Bill did in the late 40s and early 50s today.
Absolutely.
How did Carlos become acquainted and friends with Alan Shepard?
The NASA PR person.
Gene Kranz.
No, not Gene Kranz, the guy that wrote the book.
Gene Kranz was the flight director.
Flight director.
Oh,
The guy with P. Sorry.
okay. We're blanking on the name.
The NASA public relations person came to Carlos and said, "Look, we need a barber here in Clear Lake. There's nobody here. We need help. We're building a space city. Come down from South Houston and be a barber in Clear Lake." So he came down to Clear Lake and set up shop in the Holiday Inn. He found a space there that had been rented by a dentist that went bankrupt or left his school there. And his first barber chair was a dental chair.
Perfect.
Yes, and they grew, and he eventually moved his shop to Webster, Texas, which is just down the road.
And when
Go ahead.
when Carlos moved his shop to Webster, Texas, and built a small ramshack, we call it a shotgun shack here in Texas. He started first in an old pensioner's house and then built the shack. But he wasn't very popular because it was very close to the police station in Webster, Texas, which is a speed trap town, or was a speed trap town, and is trying always to escape that particular name. So Carlos built both a barbershop and then thought it would be more productive to also add a beer garden. And the kindest thing I can say was he was threatened by the police department because a man named Carlos Villagomez was not popular in a small Texas town. But he didn't leave. He was threatened at gunpoint, and he decided he'd stay and he'd become a member of the community. So he is now a very important member of the community, big Rotarian, and just built himself up over the last 50 years or so.
So for our listeners who don't know, could you describe Alan Shepard a little bit?
He's the first American in space. He was, I believe, the 10th man to walk on the moon. He's an avid golfer. From all reports, he was okay, not great, but he was avid. He was a bit of a loner.
He was a Naval Academy graduate. His father was military. He grew up in a tiny town and went to his first 6 grades with one teacher in a one-room schoolhouse. And he says the most important, Shepard several times in his memoir information, says that the most important influence in his life was the one-room schoolhouse school teacher who taught him the importance of training, remembering, and hard work at education. And you'll see this referenced throughout his life and in, for example, some of his greatest works. He won an award from the Smithsonian in the 1960s before he ever became world famous. And he was famous as a Mercury astronaut, but not famous as a scientist. And he won the Link Lecture Award. And it's a wonderful part of the book where we quote how Alan Shepard credited his training, applauded his teacher in grade school, and said that what saved his life periodically was his training, including training by simulation.
So that really leads to sort of the next area I wanted to explore. Hopefully, all of our listeners are familiar with astronauts, and certainly the Mercury 7, Gemini, and Apollo astronauts. And in many ways, they were at the top of a pyramid of thousands of people, all going towards one goal, which back then was to walk on the moon. Could you talk about that support? And you mentioned that in training, Barbara. What really was the role of all of those people behind the scenes at NASA?
To their credit, Alan Shepard and the original astronauts understood that they were not top of the pyramid. They understood that they were being more than held up, that the top of the pyramid were the federal workers who were out on the line, designing, experimenting, brilliant scientists. They lauded their secretaries who were incredible and had much management responsibility. So in the astronaut memoirs that we cite in the book and in the long interviews that we were able to obtain, every one of the astronauts we spoke to and read about were clear that they weren't considered the pinnacle and didn't consider themselves the pinnacle. So I just wanted to kind of start with that. The humility of these 7 men to a person and their colleagues as they went forward, not just these original Mercury astronauts, but all along the way, the Gemini and the Apollo astronauts, Apollo-Soyuz in particular, they understood that the key to this were people all over the country, with secretaries having an incredibly important role. And Ed, whose father worked at NASA, my dad worked at NASA, has a lot of experience dealing with and learning about what the real people on the line did. They were respected. They put us on the moon, and the astronauts know that.
An example of this is Apollo 13. The movie by Tom Hanks is quite accurate. And actually, Barbara's father is one of the people that got locked in the conference room with the banker's box of stuff that they had to fabricate a solution to a CO2 absorption problem of the spacecraft. So NASA at that time was working 24/7. Lights, all the lights at the Manned Spacecraft Center were on. Everybody was working. Gene Cernan lived in the simulator to make everything work right, make sure the astronauts were able to get home. Barbara's father made the devices to interface the CO2 absorbers. Everybody was working. And the astronauts, because the astronauts in the space capsule could not do much of anything.
We're around the same age, and I was a teenager when the first moon landing occurred. Could you guys give us sort of reflect back on what people thought of, and certainly Texans, about NASA in the 60s and how this was one of the most exciting things, literally, if not day to day, throughout the 60s as we seem to be working towards a common goal?
You want to start? I have the...
It was a magical time. We were all children of scientists. We all understood what the mission was. We were what we all called ourselves NASA Brats, and we were a very tight community. There wasn't much else going on. And it was a wonderful time, just like you read about in the books, other books too, where your days as a kid were wandering around and playing, getting into trouble. Everybody was looking out for the other, much like a military community might be, where everybody's looking out for everybody else. And our fathers were our heroes, not just for those who had military service, but for the work they were doing. It was a really wonderful, idyllic time, and I have only great memories from that period of time. Sure, we got in trouble, sure, we had problems, but we knew that this was a special time and the entire country seemed unified behind us. We understood about JFK's mission. We understood what happened when there were terrible, horrible things happening like the Apollo fire. We understood how the federal government rallied to help us back. We did understand all that because that was our parents' lives and therefore ours.
It was a bit unique in that there's only a couple bedroom communities down in the Clear Lake area during the development of the Manned Spacecraft Center, and everybody's father was either an astronaut or a rocket scientist. And when there was a launch, the TV people would come down with their trucks with the satellite dishes and cordon off the astronauts' homes, and the kids their children would be exempt from school. During school time, if there was a live TV feed, they rolled in a little black and white TV set on a big stand, and everybody watched TV, watched the moonshot or with the spacewalk. Then afterwards, when the astronauts returned home, the astronauts would come to the school and debrief us, the kids, show and tell, raise food, whatever they had. But we were completely isolated, and this was a normal experience for us. And we didn't realize until we got older and got out of the Clear Lake area that this was a very special time.
For example, Jim Lovell was head of the Boy Scouts troop, and my brothers were Boy Scouts. And so in the backyard one day, Jim Lovell, before he went to the moon, towards the moon on Apollo 13, he was showing everybody, it was twilight, he was showing everybody where he would be landing on the moon. And he said, "Stuart, go get your sister's telescope. Let's go see, let me show you in more detail." And so he ran in and he got my telescope. My dad was a navigator in World War II, so my presents were things like a nice telescope. Back then, they were pretty cheap, and I had a pretty nice telescope. I still have it right here in the corner of my office. And so these are the experiences we had. And I do relate one experience, and I checked with Chris Carpenter, Scott Carpenter's daughter, to see if her dad ever told her about it. I used to play with the family dog near the canal I was never supposed to play near. And so one time I fell in the canal with the dog. And that was a problem because it had real high levels. And so I kept wondering, how am I going to get out of here? Actually, I jumped in after the dog because I was worried about her, but I didn't think what I'd do to get out. And so I'm yelling and screaming and trying to figure out what to do. And the dog's so big, not cooperating. And so all of a sudden, somehow, somebody scrambled down, grabbed me by the scruff of my neck, and threw me up on the, I don't know how he got down, but it was Scott Carpenter. And I said, "Look, I was a little kid, but I said, I'm not supposed to be here." And he said, "I'm not going to tell. I'm not going to tell." And because he knew we're not supposed to be horsing around there if we're little kids by the canal. And so this is the way we knew these folks. They were our heroes, yes, but they were Mr. Carpenter, you know.
So could you say a few words about Charlie Duke and his reflections on Alan Shepard's leadership?
Charlie Duke knew Shepard extremely well. We were in his house for several hours as he reflected on Shepard. And we put this both in the documentary and a very long excerpt in the book. Charlie Duke found Shepard to be a brilliant leader, a taskmaster, but also a friend after the relationship changed and Shepard was no longer head of the astronaut corps, but was returned to good health and able to fly to the moon. But during the time that Shepard was the boss, he found him to be fair, stern, and completely competent. And there was a camaraderie among the astronaut corps that Shepard was able to foster, despite him having been an astronaut and Shepard not being in the job he wanted at the time. He wanted to fly. He was a pilot. He wanted to fly. And so he was a great boss. And Duke goes into much detail about that. When Shepard was able to get his medical cleared and was able to go back into space travel, he became a wonderful friend, a golf partner to Charlie Duke, one of the guys, and treated him just as one would hope, guys who have much in common, including being Naval Academy graduates, and all that goes with that you read about. And this is the kind of camaraderie that we tried to convey in the book. And we rely heavily on the words of the astronauts and in Shepard's own words about the camaraderie he experienced with his astronaut colleagues.
I want to conclude by asking you both about the importance of preserving legacies and telling stories about the past for future generations. So, Ed, maybe I could start with you. Why is that part of what you did so important?
That's part of human history. Early humans sat around a campfire talking about stories, and that's how you pass down information from one generation to the next. And we were very fortunate to living during or actually grew up in a time of extreme progression in human kindness. During the space program, it was quite unique, and a lot of that uniqueness has not been well documented. So stories are very important, and that's how people learn.
Laura Shepard and her sister called us not long ago and said, "Can we come over and visit?" They were both in town. And what she said was that this book, because we interviewed friends, family, and folks who really knew Shepard well, she said that it was the best biography she had seen of her father. And we were very touched by what she said, because we got to the aspects of the man that showed you his greatness. And we left all of our interviews with the feeling that Shepard really was the greatest of those original astronauts. And that when Tom Wolfe wrote his book and showed that was the feeling he was getting from the people he interviewed, that the best one was Shepard. And you can see that as we have a long sources section where we talk about and give more information on how folks regarded Shepard and his brilliance. He was a genius. He wasn't just a very apt pilot. He understood the importance of doing things right. Never get back on your heels is what he taught his children.
Actually, at the end of the book, there's the QR code that links to the documentary, which is more of a storytelling event than the book is a storytelling, but it doesn't have any visuals with it.
So I realized actually I need to end the episode by asking about the golf ball.
What about the golf?
What happened to the golf ball?
The golf ball stayed with Carlos. He passed it around with a bunch of his buddies for a long time. Then he realized, oh, this must be something special and stuck in a safety deposit box. Carlos and Alan never discussed the golf ball, so there's no written providence about it. We've had a space memorabilia person, Mr. Perlman, look at it. He's verified the signature. He says it's a signed golf ball by Alan Shepard, but there's no providence. We don't know what's going on with the ball. And Carlos has entrusted us with the golf ball.
And it's in a safety deposit box, but we know Carlos would love to see the story told. And one of the reasons we did this was Carlos, who is our best and longest friend since childhood. Carlos is not the man some people might think he is. He is a hero to us, and he was a hero to a number of people, thousands of people over the years. His outreach, his philanthropy now, his being is part of the Webster community. And so where the golf ball is right now, it's been displayed, it's been feted in a museum. It's the subject now of a book in the documentary. But what we'd like to do is see it displayed in a museum. It's already been premiered in a museum just a week ago. And we'd like to see it in a museum as an emblematic really of the relationships between the workers of NASA, who are so honored by the astronauts and by the upper echelon, but who aren't getting the credit nowadays for putting man on the moon and returning him home safely.
Guys, unfortunately, we are near the end of this episode, but before we leave, I wanted to ask you if our listeners could, where they can buy the book, where they can find out more information about you all or your writings. What websites or other places can they go?
The Barber, the Astronaut, and the Golf Ball is available wherever great books are sold, on Amazon, through Lauren Steffi's Stony Creek Press, through Texas A&M Press, and Barnes & Noble. We were very pleased to be carried by just about everybody. If you Google Bagby, now that's our abbreviation, BAGB, but the way to remember it is Bagby, the Barber, the Astronaut, and the Golf Ball. You will find lots of places where you can get it in many different forms. And
We also, Barbara actually did the audio recordings for the book.
So there's an audiobook version as well.
Yes.
there's an audiobook, and it's the documentary is available. The documentary is available by just going to the last page of the book, and we put a QR code, and the documentary resides in the place you'll end up with the QR code at the end of the book.
And Barbara, I wanted to thank you again for taking the time to visit with me. This has been a great episode, and I hope we can continue this conversation.
Thank you, dear.
Okay.